Good afternoon. Welcome to the 1619 Project. My name is Antonio Ruiz, along with my compatriot Thomas
Fields. How you doing, man?
How you doing, man? So this today we're dealing with Chapter 9 of the 1619 Project book, Self-Defense. And I wanted to start out with a story let's start off with the story about the Black Panthers. And there was an article, California Gun Control, how Ronald Reagan and the Black Panthers started a movement. And the state's, California's first major gun control law that was signed in 1967 by Ronald Reagan, and how that came about. Because before this law, you were allowed to carry firearms in public, making without a government issued license, as long as you didn't point the gun at someone. That was the stipulation. And so the Black Panthers Party was protesting at the state capitol, carrying shotguns and rifles, and there's a very dramatic picture of them in their leather coats and leather jackets and their berets and fros. And that, in fact, they went into the state capitol. Did they actually make it to the floor of the legislature?
I don't know. They were inside. They clearly were inside.
But they were definitely inside the building. And anyway, so they, everybody went nuts. This picture of them with these guns, and then this led to what's called the Mulford Act, and banned the carrying of firearms in public, making it a felony to do so without a government issued license. And I introduced this with the story because it's very related to the next story, which is in the book, which opens up chapter 9. And so you contrast this craziness, this idea that, we got to stop these Black Panthers, put it in quotes, Black people, from carrying guns in public.
Yeah.
So the story is about Jessie Murray Jr., who's a Black man, in February of 2014 in Jonesboro, Georgia. And he and his wife were in a bar, and there was an altercation with 4 or 5 drunken white men. And Murray went to his car to get his gun for protection. And as he was returning, he was surrounded by the men and beaten. And during the fight, Murray drew his gun and accidentally killed, he said the gun went off accidentally, killed one of the men. So he figured it was okay, it was self-defense. Georgia had a stand your ground law. And so he went to trial. He was charged with, I believe, some kind of murder, manslaughter, excuse me.
Right.
And at the trial, the judge dismissed his stand your ground defense. And he ruled that because the gun had gone off accidentally, it was impossible to claim that Murray had been standing his ground. In other words, one could not accidentally stand one's ground. And secondly, and equally important, the judge said, Murray clearly couldn't have felt threatened by the white men who were beating on him. Those men were not doing anything to make Murray reasonably believe that deadly force was necessary to prevent death or great bodily injury or a third party. And I state all those things, those two things contrasting with each other, because it's the history of this country that the idea of Black people owning guns, well, first of all, it was prohibited for a very long time. And this idea of Black people having guns to this day still scares people. Your reaction?
Oh, of course. I have a little bit of insight on this, in that I served at Fort McPherson which is about the same area this took place in. And I did have an experience where I was in a place and it was almost an altercation with me, with, 4 white guys. But, what I struggle with in this, reading that, and it's true, obviously it's true, but what I struggle with is that if a judge ruled something so outrageous, I wonder why he didn't appeal it, because on the face of it, that was clearly an appealable ruling and a very prejudicial ruling.
Yeah, it doesn't talk about that.
Yeah, because
he might have.
I mean, I wonder, because the fact is, how can he make the determination that somehow, because the gun went off accidentally, that meant the stand your ground law was null and void? I don't buy that, and I don't think any other, another court would buy it either. But I'm just raising that as a point because that's when I read this, that was the first thing that popped in my mind. That's so outrageous, and then particularly when you have George Zimmerman, what he did.
Yeah, use the same.
Contrast that, yeah. So that's where I kind of netted out in this whole thing.
It was interesting also just to read on page 266 in 2000 was it 2020, I believe, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights issued a report that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights issued a report that, here it is right here, 2020, reported on the racial implications of stand your ground laws. And the criminal justice system is 10 times more likely to rule a homicide justifiable if the shooter is white and the victim is black than the other way around. In fact, the report notes that when a white person kills an African American, it is 281% more likely to be ruled a justifiable homicide than a white on white killing. And a joint analysis by the Guilford Law Center and the Southern Poverty Law Center, citing the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report, summed up the results that consequences are predictably deadly and unequal.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that strikes me is that we have a Second Amendment, which a number of, the NRA stands behind that. They stand ready to defend, anybody supposedly who is prosecuted for having a gun, except in the case of the black person. And it strikes me that when you have these cases where, one of the more recent one was a guy had a gun in his car. He leaves the gun in his car and he runs. He shot.
Oh, yes, I remember this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's 60 times. So this is this is really instructive because he left the gun behind. He was not armed, as are many.
Yes.
Yeah, but the sight of a gun, regardless of whether or not
this drives them crazy.
Yeah, well, it is also gives police the cover to say, I felt threatened. My life was in danger. Whether or not for a sensible person that would remain true, it doesn't matter. And that's where, to me, this whole criminal justice system is not only just flawed, it's really absurd. When an individual wearing a uniform can say, I felt threatened, even if a man did not have a gun, even if he, quote unquote, I said he reached in his waistband. That used to be the code for it. He had a gun. I thought he had a gun. Therefore, I have the right.
He was reaching for his waistband.
Yeah, I have. Therefore, simply on that, I can kill him, and there's no accountability.
It was really also interesting reading about talking about the Second Amendment. There's a paragraph on 257 that begins a story about the Second Amendment ratified in 1791, codified for white citizens the right to bear arms and protect themselves. But what was interesting was this whole story about earlier during the was it Constitutional Convention? This whole idea that the idea that Black people, in this case slaves, would have access to guns just drove everybody crazy.
Of course it did.
And they did everything possible to make sure that didn't happen. And it just, there's stories about the Fugitive Slave Act meant that Black people who were even born free or had managed to buy their freedom escape slavery had no legal right to that freedom and limited means to defend themselves. Access, that is, to weapons. There's other stories here where, literally, there are massacres of Black people, but they had no way of defending themselves because they had no access. There were those revolts where they did get access to guns, but in a lot of cases they didn't have access to guns.
Let's go back to something. We're talking about the percentages of white people who are prosecuted for killing someone that's Black.
Yeah.
And versus a Black person killing someone who's white. There's a current case that illustrates that. In New York City, a off-duty correctional officer was hit with essentially a pellet gun, drive-by. And he fired into a car and killed the shooter, who was a passenger. And he is now being charged with second-degree murder. Okay. And it's happened pretty rapidly. There was no, we have to wait and see what the facts are. He was charged with that in hours. Now, if the roles have been reversed.
Right, and what race is the?
He's white.
He's white, okay.
Yeah. The correction officer was Black. The people in the car were all white. They were like young people. Now, I'm not
messing around.
Yeah, messing around. I ain't justifying that, it's legal or proper to kill anyone under those circumstances. But I'm pointing out this fact of what happened, how quickly the wheels of justice rolled when there was a white person being killed by a Black person versus what we've seen far too often when a white officer kills a Black person, particularly when it's unarmed. So that's just a perfect illustration. You can see that, you didn't see that played out.
Yeah.
And that is going to wind its way through the court because the guy's already been stripped of his badge and he's already been charged. Now, where it goes from there, we'll see.
I was just, the other part to this chapter that just blows my mind, because these are facts that just are disappearing in a lot of schools. The amount of history of where, there are cases of white people murdering African Americans, and I don't mean just like back in slavery times. This one time was actually after the Civil War. This is on page 261. Between 1865 and 1868, white people murdered more than 1,000 African Americans in one area of Texas. There's other cases here where in the mid-1870s, President Ulysses S. Grant painfully acknowledged that the slew of murders meant that white people clearly had the right to kill Negroes without fear of punishment and without loss of caste or reputation. And then, of course, we all know that into the 20th century, there were cases in Florida, Black Wall Street, and what was Black Wall Street?
Yeah, it was Tulsa. It was Tulsa.
It was Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, there was also, I believe it was Rosewood, Florida, had a similar thing. You had Wilmington, Delaware, where there was a coup d'etat because of a multiracial.
In the early 20th century.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like...
Brownsville, Texas. You can name it.
yeah, and even to this day, I mean, massacres of this. Well, I take that back. The Rochester or Buffalo, where the guy white supremacists walked into a supermarket where a majority of the customers were black.
Yeah, Charleston, we had
Yeah,
the church. You know, we
yeah,
had the bombing
yeah. So
of the church in Birmingham. You know,
right.
here's what the broader picture comes down to.
But
So,
I'm sorry. Let me just the point I'm trying to make is with all the. I recently saw this article with all the spate of this history and this thing about quote unquote CRT, critical race theory, this idea that we have to sanitize this history because we're going to make somebody uncomfortable.
of course.
And it just, when I read this, I go, if anything, we would want to look at this and figure out a way that this doesn't continue to happen. And I just, well, you know, hell, I didn't even know half of this stuff, even in school as I was growing up, because, you know, the history books back then were even more sanitized.
Yes, they were much more slanted. You know, here's what strikes me. So we have people talking about the crime rate in Black neighborhoods, the high crime rate. And you often get politicians, particularly white politicians, enraging about the Black crime rate, how it is just out of control. The question I have, what happened to the crime rate back in the 20s or 30s and the 40s, even up to 50s and 60s, that when crimes perpetrated against Black people, Black whites? Were we not keeping crime statistics then? You know, that's my comeback to all of this. You know, I mean, if you're going to talk about crime, why is crime only held to be the problem when it involves Black people on the receiving end? And when it's, and in particular, it's receiving in from other people, Black and white. But it's not perceived as being a problem back when white folks were doing it back in the pre-civil rights days. And even up to, you know, even as we've talked about it, and even beyond that. And it's all about how one positions it. And it gets back to the CRT. This is not about basically keeping people's feelings from being hurt. It's all about a coming to awareness. And one of the things this country has not done, that other countries have had similar problems have done, is have a truth and reconciliation.
Yeah.
Until you have everyone cognizant of what has happened in the past between the races, you will never have any kind of social peace.
Well, and I'm not optimistic about that, with all due respect. Maybe in 50 years. Look, let's talk about this crime person, because one of the things that I've noticed, particularly over the last year, in local news reports, a lot of also on Fox News. You know, these what do they call them? Grab and run.
Oh yeah.
You know, crimes where you see a lot of obviously young people, Black. I mean, it's pretty obvious that they're Black, who are, you know, running into luxury stores, grabbing as much as they can, and running out the door. What's interesting is how many times that plays on the loop.
Oh, sure.
And yes, this is terrible and we need to deal with it, but the psychological effect of that on the population, the general population, is that this is the problem and the only problem, justifying the inevitable backlashes that happen. The backlashes against the idea of any kind of police reform, or the backlash against the the demonstrations of 2020. It's like, okay, this is crime. Let's forget about reform because we have to come down hard on crime. And what does that mean? That's code for let's even do more in communities of color because that's where the crime is. But no crime, nobody's talking about, it's just like lumping it all together and not making any distinctions about whether it's a petty crime or whether it's a crime of opportunity because someone's got to feed their family, or whether it's something even more serious than that. And it's like, it's not just, listen, it's not just coming from the white community, it's coming from communities of color, because our instant reaction always is, what we need is more police.
Yeah, we've been fed that. But here's the,
and more importantly, not only do we need to arrest people, we need to throw away the key, even before they stand trial.
Well, let's talk about some facts that I think need to go out. So, okay, take the murder rate, the homicide rate in these communities. Homicide rate in these communities and how many of those crimes are solved. The lowest rates are in those communities.
Yeah.
But we put more cops in those communities. So the question the question you have to ask is, so as you put more and more cops in these communities and the crime rate apparently goes up, the homicide solutions to solving those crimes, particularly homicide, goes down. There's a disconnect there. There's a problem there. Why is that? We talk about, for that matter, is there in fact a solution? Well, solution certainly is not more cops, because we see the problem is not improving whatsoever. In fact, it's getting worse. And I would say if you did a cost-benefit analysis of the amount of cops and their salaries and the amount of time, and then put that against what happens in these communities, you're totally out of whack. And then here's the other part.
But Thomas, I mean, I'm just watching a report in New York City where, crime is out of control. And what are they asking for? Now they have a lot of police, right? Something like 35,000,
yes,
something like that.
I think it's the largest police department in the country.
Maybe
even in the world, but okay.
Yeah, and I mean, more police. And again, I'm not trying to say that don't do something. I'm saying that no, the knee-jerk reaction always is more police. And sometimes they rush through these folks to be, because they just, I'm not saying they're hiring anybody off the street, but the training, the thing that you can the response to everything has to be a person with a gun.
Well, it's a warrior mentality.
Let's
talk about how we train cops. It's a warrior mentality.
Oh,
you're told you go out there, and particularly in those ghettos, you're at war. The war on crime, the war on drug. You are an armed soldier going out there to fight that menace. Okay, and here's the other part of this that no one wants to talk about. So you've got a force that is going into these communities where people are below the poverty line. If they're making $15,000 annually, they're pretty well off. They're being policed by people who are making anywhere from $200,000 and up. Okay, and that is what we're dealing with.
Well, 200,000. You mean with overtime?
Well, overtime, but it's still 200,000.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you've got this great disparity. Okay, and you can say what you will, but that contributes to the problem. You think a guy who's making, let's bring it down to $150,000 without his overtime. A guy who makes $150,000, you tell him to go out into the jungle, okay, go on patrol, and he sees these people who he's already been conditioned to believe are the enemy. They're not citizens, they are the enemy.
Yeah.
And what does society expect is going to happen? And then to add fuel to that fire, every time there's something happens, we say, you know what you got to do? Bring in more cops. You exacerbate the problem. And I can't believe that this is not done intentionally. I know it's done intentionally because when I go back again to how the war on drugs started with Reagan, with Nixon saying, hey, I got to get Black folks, I got to get the lefties. The way to do that is to have a war on drugs.
I'm laughing, but I don't mean to laugh. I mean, you know, listening to a podcast just now, New York Times doing a podcast about the embedded is the podcast about examining police reform and what does that mean. And they're using the Yonkers Police Department as a sort of an example. And what does that mean? Does it mean that more training? Does it mean more efforts at community policing? Does it mean like really vetting people before they become police officers? And I just can't get over the fact that talking about warrior mentality, you still have police departments who there's an inventory being done about the number of military vehicles and armaments that in Orange County that the police departments have there. So you talk about, on one hand, the idea of reform, and no one's really quite sure what the hell that means. And because it's not just reforming police, it's also the whole legal system that goes behind them. And then you're still talking about we need more police, no talking about, their training and how you select police officers, nothing about how to deal with people who may have mental health issues or people who are standing on a street corner and then get hassled. I mean, there's none of this conversation. It's always, again, back to what they did in the 70s, what they did particularly in the 90s, when with the crime bill, is we need to put more, and even Biden's talking about, we need to put more.
Bill add more,
more police officers, and everything else gets sort of mixed up in there. And all that's supposed to make us safer is, if we just put more police officers, which by the way are reactive, not that they don't prevent crime. I don't care what they do.
If we were truly serious about reducing crime, we would start putting social programs and jobs in those communities. No one talks about that. Or I shouldn't say no one. Very few people talk, but that is really the way it stops. Those communities, those ghettos, were made intentionally. And if you don't believe me, you can look at the way cities and municipalities have zoned. You can look at the way they put freeways and highways through those communities, thriving communities.
Yeah.
You can look at the way they send out business licenses. You can look at the way they basically redlined the communities with insurance. You can't get insurance. You can look at the way banks refuse to give loans in those communities. That's the recipe for creating a ghetto. When you put that all together, what does one expect is going to happen? And then you say the remedy is more cops.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Military occupation.
Yeah.
This other thing that came out of this chapter I thought was really interesting. When you look at the history of Black people and weapons, historically, prevented by law from owning weapons. And now with the recent Supreme Court ruling on concealed weapon permits, the question is, how will law enforcement treat the many POC who may want to take advantage of concealed weapon permits? There was an experiment, two guys, there's a video floating around about it, where this was in a state where open carry, and he had an AR-15 There was a white guy and there was a black guy. The white guy had an AR-15, and I think there was an encounter with police, but they, once they realized that he was no threat, they didn't hassle him. And then the black guy came out with his AR-15, and they found every reason to hassle him.
Mhm.
Well, there's a bullet in the chamber. It's against the law. Well, okay, you're right. But they had him on the ground. They had, they made him take the gun off. And so I'm just always curious about, as more and more Black people or people of color, not me, I'm not ready to have to walk around with a concealed weapon. And even in some states where it's not going to be concealed, it's going to be open carry.
Right.
Will they be treated the same as white people with the same permits?
Of course they won't be.
And in some states that don't even have permits.
Yeah, of course they won't be. I mean, it's going to be, the answer to that question. It's a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
Okay. There's going to be more suspicion and more of a sense of threat if it's a person of color walking around with a gun than there is of a white person. You can see it frequently. In both instances where the perpetrator of a mass murder was white, they didn't get shot.
No.
I mean,
do you need a Wendy burger?
They didn't get shot. It's kind of fascinating, just that if you just look at the optics, and I defy anyone to say the optics of that are not good. I mean, the reason why the federal government never kept statistics on the number of people killed by police, because it's pretty damning.
Yeah.
It was left up to the Washington Post and the New York Times to basically put together,
track those things.
Yeah, because it's a dirty secret. Just becoming less and less of a secret with the advent of with the advent of phone cameras.
Right. Let me ask you, because I think it's a legitimate, what you just said earlier about, that the answer is not just putting more police, because it's inevitable what happens, whether it's stop and frisk, whether it's hassle. I mean, the number of videos that are available now online showing confrontations that escalate, mostly because they're escalated by the police. I think I told you about this trend I've been watching for some time now. These are the First Amendment audit people.
Mm-hmm.
These are the people who stand on a sidewalk, in some cases, like walk into a federal building, like the post office. I've seen those, but a lot of it is from outside a building. Sometimes it's a government building. Sometimes it's a place of business, and they will be just videotaping.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure what they're videotaping, but they're videotaping using phones. And so inevitably a security guard comes out, wants to know why they're there, and they say it's none of your business. And it escalates sometimes to the point where they're really being hassled. And it's like I don't have to answer your questions. I don't have to say anything, depending on what the state is. But so what I've noticed is it's obvious there's a white guy doing it, and then there's a black guy doing it. And I look at who gets more hassled to the point of being arrested. It's like, well, you've seen it plenty of times when there's been an arrest of a person of color, and people are videotaping it, and the amount of pushback from the police, sometimes to the point of people being arrested, being pummeled, that whole kind of thing. And so my point I'm trying to make here in a roundabout way is this idea of putting more police into communities to make what is already an explosive situation it just makes me wonder, like,
We don't live in
is
it,
it-
so we don't care.
excuse me, excuse me.
I mean, come on, it's not my problem. I don't have to deal with it. And it's in fact, what it does, it helps me get votes. But there's no.
But it's not just. I mean, it's the politicians are not all just white who are calling
No,
for this.
certainly not.
And I'm just, and there's people in the community who call for this, because the knee-jerk reaction always is, what we need is more police to keep us safe. And I'm going, look at the history in that community. Has it kept you safe?
Well, if you don't teach it in schools, if historians don't have access to this information, how do you know? How do you know about this stuff? I mean, there's a wonderful book which I have to read, which is called Locking Up Our Own, which basically points out that in I believe the 70s and 80s, in these cities, when they were starting to be run by Black mayors, when they perceived that there were drugs and crime rate was, quote unquote, going up, they used that as well to keep in power. They were actively saying, we need to put them in prison. We need, basically the 3 strikes thing.
Yeah.
I will say this, for the most part, there's very little difference between an opportunistic Black politician and optimistic white politician. They basically will use the same leverages to stay in power and to gain power. That's and that's where a lot of this start. I mean, the ghettos look like they do the way they do because Black politicians often aided and abetted.
Yeah. Back to, I want to close back to the issue of self-defense, because one of the things, back to this issue of, I've seen videos and interviews with gun clubs that are Black, and Latino gun clubs. And they always talk about the same thing. It's interesting. They'd say, well, we want to have the same right of protection and self-defense as anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it is just, they go out to the range and they shoot, that whole kind of thing. But some of it is also taking back the right that they feel legitimately that they've never had access to.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to remember the one of those Breakfast Club interviews on New York radio station, where the guy was saying, listen, if we had more access to guns, this is a Black host talking about it, then we would feel that we could defend ourselves. Now, there was a guy on the show who was saying, well, most times you end up shooting yourself in the leg. But the point I think he was trying to make, the Black host, was that this is a right that we have not had a lot of access to in the past, whether it was gun control, right? But even before so-called gun control, modern day gun control, we didn't have access because there were laws that prevented Black people from having this. And we can argue, I'm not completely convinced that, you're carrying around a gun on your hip in full view that makes you more safe. In most cases, I really do think you end up shooting yourself in the foot, or worse, shooting other people by mistake. But I come back to this issue of, you're also making yourself a target.
Well,
and I don't think just by police. I think there's a lot of white supremacists who would see that as a threat.
But don't think there are not a lot of guns in those communities.
Well, yes.
Okay, there are lots, and in fact,
but the difference is
many gun shops set up business in those communities. In fact, they've done studies that show that a lot of the guns that are found to have committed crimes are predominantly come from those gun shops or in those communities or outside those communities, and are not owned by Blacks. Okay, so let's state that up front. And unfortunately, particularly in those kind of communities, too many people resort to solving their issues, their beefs, their gripes with guns.
Yeah.
Often because they don't trust the police to resolve issues. They don't trust the courts to resolve those issues.
Right.
So, I mean, having guns and the right to bear arms in those communities is not a panacea. It comes with a double-edged sword. Yes, we are given that right to defend ourselves, and we should be able to fulfill that right to defend ourselves. But again, you have to look at the greater society problems. The greater society problems is that guns often are used basically when people are used by people that least likely, that really should not have them.
Yeah. No, I agree. No, I will not be getting a concealed weapon permit anytime.
You're not going to get yourself a Glock.
I have to say that my greatest fear is that I probably would shoot myself in the foot.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been great once again talking about 1619 Project with my friend Thomas Fields, and we'll continue this in the next episode.
Another time.
Chapter 10.
Day. Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot, Thomas.
See you, man. Good talking.